Why sampling for me? I ask myself that same question sometimes, like, how did I even wind up here? I would define sampling as taking any piece of audio and putting it into a device that can manipulate that piece of audio. In its simplest form, a sampler is something that can change the length of a sample in terms of time, and the pitch of a sample in terms of the speed or pitch it plays it back. Those are really the two operative things that a sampler can do. It might sound simple, but when you dig into just those two functions, there's a whole lot that you can do with a machine. If you think of a one-bar drum pattern, you could take that one-bar drum pattern apart into eighth notes, 8 pieces. In a standard backbeat, 2 of those pieces are going to be snares. Maybe 2 of those pieces are going to be a kick drum, and the other, at least 4 of those pieces are going to just be an isolated hi-hat. And now, functionally, you have a drum kit that you can play at will with your fingers. The devices that can be used for sampling range from, in its most primitive form, a reel-to-reel tape machine, which was many people consider the origins of sampling. The second notable sampler that I am aware of is the Mellotron, which technically played pre-recorded segments of audio spread across a keyboard. Moving up to the 80s, I want to say the Emulator, somewhere around there, was the first digital sampler. Effectively, from the Emulator up until now, everything's just on a continuum of a digital sampler. So I came of age making hip-hop in the 90s, and at that time, in 1997, when I went to buy my first sampler, the main tools that people had access to was the ASR-10, the MPC 3000, and when the MPC 2000 was released, that was a landmark because the price dropped on that machine down to about $1,300. So today I am using the MPC 2000 XL, which I've used since whenever that model was released. I want to say sometime around 2001 or 2002. I think constraints when it comes to art ultimately have more upsides than downsides. The limits of the sample time in an MPC were a fabulous limit for me. If you're in a creative rut, consider limiting vastly what you have to work with. Most of the time, that's a way to break those creative ruts that you can be in. In the abstract, it's such a weird discipline to pursue and be a part of. The truth of the matter is that this isn't a thing I sought out as a discipline to learn. I was dragged into this world, frankly, from the somewhat randomized path that I took in music. But the bottom line is that once I was a hip-hop DJ, I couldn't help but be curious about samples that were being used on the records that I was playing. I couldn't help but be curious about buying a sampler. And before I know it, I'm 2 or 3 or 4 years into having a sampler, looking for records all day. This is my life. This is just what I'm doing. I spend usually around 12 hours a day either digging for records, listening to records, labeling records, or learning how to use this machine. I was years into it before I realized really what I was doing, frankly. If you pay attention to how your mind works when you're working on a sampler, you'll realize that you aren't thinking in terms of how a keyboard scales up across octaves, or a guitar does, or a drum programming grid scales in time. You start thinking in building blocks. You start thinking in pieces and abstractions and geometrical shapes. It's a very different way of thinking than you utilize when you sit down to write a chord change. It's changed my ear. It's changed how I listen to music. It's changed my understanding of what can be done to make music. To say that it's fun and it's a thrill would be understating the true complexity of it. Thinking of sound as not a performance as much as a piece of recorded audio is so radically different than the experience of playing music in a traditional sense, both in its experience and also in its outcome. Every time I hear an Oberheim drum machine on a Prince record, maybe not every single time, a lot of the time I'm reminded of the fact that that was recordings of real drums. It's the only thing that makes it sound like a drum machine is that you're hearing the exact same recording of a snare over and over and over and over and over. But the tonality and the texture of the snare itself sounds somewhat like an acoustic drum. Your ear doesn't hear it in the context of a song as such because of the fact that it's repeating. Every person, even kids, they can identify the sound of a drum machine, and effectively what they are identifying is, I'm hearing that exact same recorded sound, not just any snare that's being played on a 2 and 4. They're not identifying the rhythm, they're identifying the texture and tonality of the sound itself. Subscribe to soundfly.com for this course and all of their creative music courses.